Makadini, sanibonani, habari yako. Welcome to another episode of the Difficult Emotion series, and we are talking about some of the most difficult emotions to deal with, to have, to just go through, and that's grief, fear, and rejection. If, like me, you've been through any of these three, I'm sure all of us have, but some more than others, right? I know they say, oh, you can't compete with grief, but I think you can. There are some people who have experienced grief in life more than others. It's not a competition. It's not something that actually people like to talk about, especially those who've gone through it. But it is a reality of life, and so we need to kind of find our ways of going through it. I, for one, I experienced grief as a child, and so that was quite difficult to navigate and find ways of then going through life without wearing it so much so on my shoulders. But yeah, with time, I did manage to do it. With time, with therapy, and with friends and other things. Some of the behavior is not quite good, but that's what happens, especially with some of these three. With grief, with fear and rejection, the responses sometimes can be so bad. But we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the causes. We'll talk about the reactions or the responses to grief. Actually, most of the time you react because it's unexpected. And then the effects. What sort of person can you become because of these three emotions, right? So what are the causes? Grief, simple. Loss. Fear is usually a result of trying to protect yourself, whether it's physically, emotionally, mentally. And fear sometimes can also be the protecting yourself from against a real threat, like something that people can see, as well as a perceived threat. We'll talk about that more later. And then, of course, rejection. Rejection comes from not being accepted, not being invited, wanting to be part of a group or someone else's life or an event, and just not being pulled in. Right. So let's begin with defining one of my favorite definitions of grief by Jamie Anderson. So, defining grief. And Jamie Anderson says grief is love with no place to go. In 2021, I started a grief support system group because, as you know, through COVID, a lot of people lost friends, family. It was just a lot to go through. And so we started this group where we would talk about it. And really, it was evident that really you have love for specific people and specific things, right? And places and experiences, and that love can never be transferred. So if you are grieving or towards your mother, for example, you lose your parent or a sister or a cousin, someone, you cannot then say, oh, okay, because I lost them and this is the love, the grief I'm feeling for them. Instead of feeling this love for them, I can put it into someone else. You cannot. It's impossible. It's not possible at all. Well, if you think it's possible, let me know in the comments or, get in touch. But that love remains in you, but now you can't call them to show them love. You can't buy them a gift. You can't do the things that you used to do for them as love, because I believe love, of course, is a verb. So all the actions that you could do, all those loving actions you could give, you can't give because that particular person is no longer there. But grief is also, it's like I said, grief is not only for death in terms of physical death of loved ones. It can also come as a consequence of losing a relationship. So if, for example, someone might grieve the loss of marriage when they get divorced, it's because, like I said, most of the time it's unexpected. No one goes into marriage with the idea of, okay, yeah, this is going to be 5 years and then we divorce. Well, if you do, then well done. You're well prepared for life. But for most people, even the person who initiates, actually, I would like to think more so the person who initiates the breaking of the marriage probably might not have anticipated it. And this is, no one planned that when I grow up, I want to be married and divorced, but it happens. Or even friendship. Sometimes you can grieve the end of a friendship that you thought was good, only to be told, no, you're a bad friend. I don't want to hang out with you anymore, or you're toxic. So many reasons. And from grief, we will talk about fear. We'll define fear. And believe, I was just taking definitions from different people, which I found interesting. Maybe I might not, I agree with to a certain level, but Robert Heller defines fear as excitement without breath, which I found quite interesting. Initially, my first response was, no, it can't be excitement, because excitement for me means, you are looking forward to it. Whereas with fear, the feeling, the same adrenaline feeling might be there, but you cannot breathe. So that's now that part. So fear can be dilapidating. It can take over your life and just make it miserable. No one wants to be afraid. I love that saying, oh, they have nothing to fear but fear itself. Unfortunately, for many of us mortals here, for many of us mortals, fear is a real thing. We have other things that we fear that are not fear. We fear other people. We fear loss, like grief. We fear things, people, spiders, drowning, events, poverty, a lot of other things that we fear. And we are uncomfortable when we are afraid. And then, of course, rejection. Rejection, I couldn't find quite the quote that I wanted, but I think rejection is my definition, my personal definition of rejection is the act of not being included by others, right? And whether it's a job rejection, whether it's a relationship rejection, in family, in romantic senses, in friendship senses, that is what rejection is. So it comes to it is a consequence of people not seeing your value, not, or maybe seeing it but not in the capacity that you'd like them to see it. So for example, you might have a friend who you think, oh, this could be a great lover, it could be a great partner, but they reject that notion. They think you're just fine where you are. So you are put in a zone. And I always think, there was a lady I once watched on social media who talked about there's no such thing as a friend zone. And I thought, well, she might be right, because putting someone in a zone implies that there's a possibility of getting out. And I think that there are people who are just your friends and that's it. It's not necessarily a zone. There are people who I would feel more comfortable remaining as friends with, and not, because a life partner is a whole different ball game. So I wouldn't consider them for that. But as someone who I can see once in a while, go out for coffee with, do an event, and then go home, they're fine. So I probably have rejected people based on that. And I probably have been rejected based on that, because someone might be like, oh, you're fabulous, Hannah, but I cannot live with you day to day. And so we feel hurt. And this is a very difficult emotion to actually accept. Rejection is difficult because, everybody thinks that they're worth something. So for example, you go to work, to a job, and then you apply for a job and they tell you, no, you can't. And sometimes rejection is not necessarily about you. Maybe there's just somebody else who is better at that position than you are. Of course, there's other types of rejection that has nothing to do with competition. So you have people who have been rejected by their family, their parents. It is not about the competition, but it's also about the feeling of inadequacy on the part of the person who is rejecting. So very complex sort of emotion to deal with. And actually getting to rejection is quite a very complex notion, event, activity. Right. And so what are the effects of it? The effects of all three of these generally. So, because I just want to keep this podcast short, this discussion short, I'm just going to mention 3 negatives and 3 positives. Right. So, for example, the first one, self-pity effect. So, when you're angry, when you're afraid, when you feel rejected, there's a tendency to feel sorry for yourself because you have like this deep, you go into yourself, so you become the center of the things that are happening, and you only consider what your pain is, right? So yes, grief is about your pain most of the time. I always think about it. I've been to so many funerals, and every time I think about it, I feel like, yeah, we say rest in peace, and probably this person is resting, but funerals are for the people who are left behind and not so much for the person who's gone. Because, hey, let's face it, there's some people during war times, there are people who died in the forest. They had no proper funerals, but there were people probably somewhere who missed them, right? But that is for us because we are looking at what we've lost because of this person's departure. We might have lost a caring home or a loving sibling, whatever that case might be. So from self-pity, we can move to being withdrawn. That means that because when you lose someone in grief, when it comes to grief, there are some people that we lose who are the people who understand us. And it's so hard to then try and find someone else, to teach someone else, this is how I am, this is how I want to be loved, accepted, and all these things, even in rejection, right? So if you get rejected enough times in life, I feel, of course, that tendency to then say, okay, look, you know what? Goodbye, world, I'm done. I'm just done. And we become withdrawn. We fortify ourselves and our hearts so that we don't go through pain again. Because again, all these emotions, the common factor is pain, pain, pain. Okay, so being withdrawn or being guarded, same vein. But then with being guarded, sometimes you can actively push people away. So with being withdrawn, it's actively removing yourself. But being guarded at the time is when people come towards you, you're like, no, 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 no. It's fine, you can go. Because you've got that fear and or the fear of, or that grief, or even that residual feeling that comes from rejection. However, on the other side, a consequence of these difficult emotions, and I think all of the difficult emotions we're going to talk about, I will include empathy. Because empathy is it's really a result of people who have got, you understand people not just from the point of view of reading and thinking and having mental understanding. You've got a heart understanding. I always say when we do the confidence building, when I ask the people what is empathy, and people have that statement, walking in someone's shoes, and I'm like, I'm a shoe size 6. And I always ask, what size shoe do you wear? Even if you're exactly a shoe size 6 like me, what type of size 6? Is it stretched? Is it narrow? Because really, let's be honest, we cannot walk in other people's shoes. There's no such thing. We can't. We have different types of shoes. But I think that empathy, of course, is a result of understanding someone else's decisions or actions. And it's actually easier if you've gone through a similar road, a similar path. In Shona, we say musivi wenzira mfambi, ndiye mfambi wayo. As in, the person who knows the road is one who has walked it. So yeah, you can be sympathetic towards Hannah because, oh no, she's an orphan. She was an orphan when she grew up. Okay, well, you never stop being one. But losing a parent at 8 and 11 is different from someone who loses a parent at 35. And it's so hard to let people know this thing because people then say, oh no, I now understand. No, you do not understand going through teenagehood without a mother. It's a whole different ballgame. But someone who has gone through it will have a different understanding and a viewpoint. So the traits of empathy are grown through those experiences of these difficult emotions. And you can learn to be kind. Yes, some people go withdrawn, but some people become kinder. You understand that the world is full of this pain that comes from rejection, from grief, and from fear. And then also, lastly, you can also be more accepting of people. So they say that, I think it was Brené Brown who said that if you want to care for people, get close. Like, know someone, have a conversation with them, sit down, and you will find that even your worst enemy and their little traits or whatever that annoys you about them, you might become more accepting when you understand what's behind those shields that people put up in order to protect themselves from further pain. Right. So as always, my message is coming from my heart, and I hope that it makes its way to yours. And if you have any of these difficult feelings and you would like to talk about them, and maybe they have reduced your confidence and you have no idea how to regain your confidence, because one of the things that all these difficult emotions do is that they can reduce or even just take away a person's confidence. I mean, especially rejection. If you get rejected, it's very difficult to continue being a positive person. But as always, my message comes from my heart, and I hope it finds its way to yours. Love and light. Mwah.